We're continuing our partnership with Learn Liberty today, and joining me is an author and associate professor of philosophy at the College of William and Mary, Chris Freiman. Welcome to the Rubin Report.
Thanks for having me.
All right, man. We're going to do philosophy for an hour. Are you ready?
Sounds good.
Yeah. You are prepared. I feel the jacket-shirt combo, it's very philosophy professor.
I said, give me the Rubin, and this is what my tailor came up with.
All right, let's talk philosophy, because I think one of the things that I try to do on this show is I talk about philosophies more than people, ideas more than people. And it seems to me we live in a time where we don't do a lot of philosophy and idea stuff well, and I guess that's maybe why people are watching this. So let's do a little philosophy 101 with you. Give me just some of the basics of what people should understand about philosophy.
Okay, well, yeah, that's a great question.
How's that for an open-ended question to start?
That's good, okay. Yes, that might take the hour, but yeah, so I think, you know, at the fundamental level, philosophy is about challenging assumptions. I think one thing that makes philosophy different from other sorts of academic disciplines is that you can't really take anything for granted. So when you're doing philosophy, you have to justify why killing people is wrong, for example, why feeding the hungry is good. And all of these things that we take for granted at the level of everyday life, philosophy calls into question, and I think that's really important. And so the kinds of philosophical questions that I'm most interested in are ones having to do with moral right and wrong, justice, injustice, the moral importance of economic equality, these sorts of things, and also the ethics of public policy. So, for example, one thing that non-philosophical disciplines can do is make predictions about what a given policy is likely to do. So, will opening the borders lead to higher unemployment, higher GDP, something like that? But all things considered, they can't really tell us what the right thing to do is. So you say, okay, suppose it turns out that opening borders will slightly increase domestic unemployment, but it also will mean that certain workers in the developing world will see their incomes rise by 300%, for example. This leaves open the question of what should we do? Is that a trade-off that we should make? And that's really what philosophy tries to answer, is what should we do, all things considered. All
right, so in a little bit we're going to get to some of your moral philosophies that you care about, and economic philosophies, and immigration, and a bunch of other things in just a little bit. But first, I'm curious, what got you interested in philosophy in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I was doing philosophy before I realized I was doing philosophy, because arguing, let's say good-natured arguing, was the family tradition in my household. So ever since I was a little kid, my parents and my sister and I, we would argue about religion and politics and these sorts of things, right and wrong, the economy. And when I got a little bit older, I started reading things in philosophy and economics, columns, articles, and things like that. And I realized that there was this kind of formal discipline called philosophy where you could argue about right and wrong and justice and injustice. And if you were very lucky, you could get a job doing this. I thought, if I get paid to do this.
Not a lot of jobs doing it.
Not a lot of jobs, not paid very much either. But it's kind of like saying, you can get paid to eat ice cream for a living. I thought, oh, okay, that's a pretty good gig if I can get it. And so that was kind of the start of the trajectory into philosophy.
Yeah, it's interesting because I came from a very similar family in that regard, where we argued about everything from economics and religion and all of those things. And I guess perhaps if this is what led you here, it's kind of what led me here as well. But we're missing that these days, don't you think? Like, that must infuriate you as someone that cares about ideas, when you watch the news and watch all these people that aren't arguing from like a principled position or something like a philosophically thought out position, but just from like a party place or a partisan place. It must drive you nuts.
It does, because I care about ideas. I care fundamentally about good arguments. So this is something that I hope happens to my students in my classes, is they come in with a set of preconceptions. They have, their partisan political beliefs. Everybody does. I have my partisan political beliefs. But I hope we can try as hard as we can to just focus on the arguments, think critically, and maybe change our minds, even if it means admitting that we were wrong, or finding out that we have different political or religious beliefs from our friends. We should really just follow wherever the arguments lead us.
Do you actually like it when you find out you were wrong on something? Because when I've had the moments on this show, and the most famous one is when I had Larry Elder in here, and he just kind of beat me senseless with facts. And we've since become friends, and he was on just recently, and I love the guy. That it was scary in the moment. Like, sitting there in the moment of being beaten is not fun, but afterwards when you go, whoa, that's what it's about, it's actually pretty cool.
Yes. So I don't like you said, in the moment, I don't like being bludgeoned. But
because I got a couple things I'm going to bludgeon you with pretty good over
I would
here.
expect nothing less.
Yeah.
But long term, I think that's right. It shows growth. And the funny thing is that what are we afraid of when it comes to changing our mind? And admitting we're wrong, what's really the harm in that? And I like the process of arguing. It's, you know, a form of recreation or something, like a form of exercise. I think it was Edmund Burke who said something like, the person who my adversary is actually my best friend, or something like this. So the person that is willing to argue with you in good faith and genuinely cares about getting at what's true rather than what maybe confirms their prior political beliefs. That's a person that I want to hang out with. That's the person I want to talk with.
One of my best friends growing up, his name's Ari, Greek. So he was all into Greek philosophy and all that, and he was my intellectual sparring partner from literally from 12 years old till well past college, even now. And ironically, we actually agree more now than ever before, which is sort of weird because we both had sort of reverse philosophical journeys or political journeys, but that's actually what it's all about. So tell me a little bit about some of the philosophers that have affected you.
So one of my favorites is probably John Stuart Mill. So he was a classical liberal. So he's what's known as a utilitarian, and this is a moral theory that essentially says the right thing to do is the thing that has the best consequences, the thing that produces the most happiness for everybody who's affected. I find that view attractive in moral philosophy. But he was also a classical liberal politically. He was a big defender of free speech. Free discussion in particular. His book On Liberty is probably the single greatest defense of freedom of speech.
I travel with it. You know, I'm on tour right now. I travel with it. It's a thin book. Yeah. Everyone should have it.
You can put it right under your pillow. And sleep on it. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So what? Okay. So you mentioned classical liberalism. Okay. Everyone knows my feelings on this. Do you see any meaningful distinction between classical liberalism and libertarianism at this point?
I think that libertarianism is probably a bit narrower than classical liberalism. But this is a matter of debate. I don't have a very firm opinion on this. But when I think of a libertarian, I think of somebody who says the state should do the following three things: have a court system, have police force, and maybe enforce contracts, something like that. No more. Maybe some kind of very small social minimum, Milton Friedman negative income tax type thing. Whereas I think classical liberals are more friendly to a more active state. But I would also say that I'm happy to say that libertarians are part of the classical liberal family.
Yeah. You know. It's funny because I had Don Boudreau in here a couple weeks ago talking about this, and I fall on that path where the more I go down the libertarian route, I really like that line of thinking. I still think there's some utility of the state, but I think the more that you have these conversations, for me, I'm finding it harder and harder to defend anything related to the state, which is I guess I'm taking a philosophically fair approach to this because I'm taking in new information.
I'm the same way. So I think that the best arguments for something like classical liberalism or libertarianism is just the pervasiveness of government failure. So, you know, you look at where actual government money goes, not in theory, but in practice where it goes, what sorts of groups are advantaged and disadvantaged by the state. I think that the government just doesn't work very well. And so the same reasons why we don't want the government producing food, for example, are also reasons why we might not want the government in the business of, say, running schools.
Right. So do you think it would be fair to say that if it ran well, if this thing was a slim, trim operation and it was financially sensible and we had people of good moral character in the government and the rest of it, that you'd actually have no reason to be certainly a libertarian and perhaps even a classical liberal? You might actually be more of some sort of big government Democrat or something like that.
I think that's right, so, at least from my perspective. So as I said, I'm a fan of Mill and utilitarianism, the idea that the right thing is the thing that produces the best results. And so I think in a world in which the state was run by angels, very wise people, very benevolent people, and it produced good results, I would be happy to accept a big activist government, a regulatory and redistributive state. But I think there are very powerful reasons for thinking that that's not the world that we live in.
So I think that some of my audience, when they hear you talk about Mill and what's best for everyone, they're going to view that through some sort of lens of collectivism, which is going to set some bells off. So can you unpack that a little bit?
Right. Yeah. So for what it's worth, my view is that a system that produces the most happiness, the most flourishing, the most prosperity is something like a libertarian minimal state, perhaps with a small social minimum. So when you look historically at collectivist regimes, say the Soviet Union or North Korea, something like that, these don't have a good track record of making people happy. When you look at the societies that actually make people happy compared to the alternatives, they tend to be limited government, free market, civil libertarian-ish kind of states.
All right, so what other philosophers affected you? You're one for one. Yeah, I mean, you gave me John Stuart Mill right up the top.
I'll give you somebody who you might not like, although you might not be familiar with him. Peter Singer, who's a contemporary utilitarian. And a lot of people, I think a lot of classical liberals and libertarians aren't big fans of his, although I think they need not be fans of his. So he's famous for a number of things. He has a number of very controversial positions on a lot of things. But one of his more famous thought experiments involves you imagining that you're walking somewhere and you pass a small child who's drowning in a shallow pond, and you can save this child at a very low cost to you. All that's required is that you step into the pond, get your shoes muddy, and pull the child out, but this means you'll have to spend, I don't know, $100 on new shoes. And he says, clearly, the sacrifice of $100 worth of shoes is worth saving this child. And so this suggests that we have strong obligations to make personal sacrifices for the betterment of the world's poor. And I think that's right, as at the level of moral principle, for example. But I think a lot of libertarians and classical liberals worry that what this is going to mean is we ought to have large welfare states, we ought to have billions of dollars channeled into foreign aid and so on, and I can understand why they make that leap, but I don't think that follows, especially, again, if you look at the track record of whether or not the government does a good job of helping the poor, and I think it generally doesn't.
Yeah, so, and I definitely want to get to your thoughts on that. So do you view that sort of as like, that's sort of like a micro-macro argument, that at a micro level, yeah, you'd probably do it, like I'm sure if either one of us were walking down the street, right, we wouldn't care that much about our shoes and able to save somebody, but at a societal level, which probably gets to a lot of your economic arguments as well. The more that you keep giving over to society, the more that it keeps taking, in essence.
Well, so I think as individuals in their private lives, if they do a good job of, say, researching which private charities do a good job of alleviating poverty in the developing world, and I think there are some, then we would have, in some sense, a societal obligation to help, just in the sense that most people of means have this obligation to, say, donate some of their paycheck to the Against Malaria Foundation, for example. But I think that doesn't justify saying we want the state in the business of redistributing income on a global level, if only because it just doesn't do a very good job of it and oftentimes makes poverty even worse.
All right, so you are a blogger at Bleeding Heart Libertarians.
Yes.
Now, I've seen the site before, and I checked it out again before you got here. But I thought, all right, the phrase "bleeding heart libertarians," that sort of sounds like what a classical liberal is, like, right? We got a little more heart, in essence, or we're okay with a little more state to hopefully make sure the people who need it the most are okay. But I think a lot of people will see those terms at odds: bleeding heart libertarian.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, in light of the conversation about Peter Singer, because I do think that we have, and I think a lot of classical liberals agree that we have this strong obligation to uphold political institutions that work particularly well for the poor. And this isn't just, even though the term bleeding heart libertarians is new, this isn't just something that popped up in the last 5 or 6 years. If you go all the way back to Adam Smith, he has this argument about the division of labor and free trade. He says, you know, you sitting at your desk trying to make pins all by yourself, maybe you could do 2 or 3 in a day. You have a division of labor where one person's straightening the wire, the other person's putting the pin on the wire, and so forth. Makes us massively more productive than we otherwise could be. And then through free trade, everybody's welfare is increased. But he stresses that this is particularly good for the poor, because he says a society in which we're very productive and we have this abundance of material goods is a society in which these sorts of goods are going to be a lot cheaper. And this is, in fact, what we see. And so a society in which the real price of not just necessities, but also things that we might consider luxuries, like smartphones or something. A society that makes those abundant and cheap is a society that's very good for the poor. So I think a bleeding heart libertarian or classical perspective is hundreds of years old, although we haven't done a good job of marketing ourselves, perhaps.
Yeah. How would you actually define what good is? I mean, I know that's a tough one.
Yeah, so that's a big question. So here's the evasive answer: is that it depends on which philosopher you're talking to.
Right.
So yeah, so some philosophers think so Mill has this view that the good consists of pleasure, but it's a sophisticated view where some pleasures are of higher quality than others. So if, I don't know, you have pleasure as a result of shooting up heroin, and that's equal in intensity and duration to the pleasure that you get from reading Shakespeare, there's something qualitatively better about the Shakespeare than the heroin. And so that's his view, is that it's a life of pleasure, but where you have these higher and lower pleasures. Other utilitarians think all pleasure is created equal. Other people have maybe more complicated views where a bunch of stuff makes a life good. So it's pleasure, it's knowledge, it's living a morally virtuous life, and so on. And this is a debate that we've been having for 2,500 years with no end in sight.
I sense I know where you stand on that, but do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well, so I think that it's a good question.
As long as you're here.
Yeah, as long as I'm here. So what is good? Well, so I think the good for a particular person is probably what a philosopher would call the satisfaction of your informed preferences. So essentially getting what you want if you know what it is that you're getting. So for example, you might want the liquid that is in your glass right now because you have the belief that it's water, but if that belief is false because it turns out to be vodka or something like that, you might have a desire for what's in there, but the desire is in some sense informed by this false belief. But if you had perfectly true beliefs about the world, and then you desired, say, that cup of water, I'd say, well, that's good for you to get that water. You're getting what you want.
Yeah. So you basically believe that selfishness is good?
No, because I think that most people, in fact, have preferences, rational preferences for the welfare of other people. So I would say, most...
Can you make a selfish argument for that? Because the way I've always sort of understand, or at least the way I use these words now, is that by doing what is good for me, that doesn't mean I want to ransack the entire world.
Right.
I want to do good so that it's good for my community. I want to take care of my own house so that my neighbor hopefully will be like, I'm next door to someone with a nice house and they're going to take care of their house. So I view selfishness, I guess that's a little more of an Ayn Rand thing, where I view selfishness actually as a virtue.
Yeah, so I think the difference would be in, say, a case where you're walking and see the child drowning in the shallow pond. The question would be, well, what is the reason why you're saving this child and ruining your boots? I think a good answer to that is, well, because I care about the child's welfare. And in some sense, it's true that that's a preference that you have. So it's your preference. And so you could call it a sort of, I don't know, self-guided or self-directed preference. But I wouldn't call it a selfish preference in the sense that you expect, in some sense, this child's welfare to directly translate into benefits for you. Right,
but you would feel good after. I get it. Like you wouldn't, you'd be a pretty twisted person if you were like, well, walking by and like, well, how's that going to make me feel after? No, you should do what's right, but I know what's right can often lead to all sorts of bad things. But I think you could make a selfish argument for that. Like, you know that if you walk by a child that you could easily help and you don't, you're going to feel shitty after if you have any shred of conscience. You know?
Right. So I hope, so most non-sociopaths, I hope, have that sort of psychological disposition. And as far as sort of so I think also what morality is more concerned with is not just the good of the individual, but sort of the good of all. So I think sort of what the morally right thing to do is figuring out the decision, so this is the kind of Millian utilitarian view, that the right thing to do is basically that which produces the most good for everybody, not just an individual person. So it could be in some cases that a person's individual good comes apart from what's morally good. So you could imagine somebody who just has no desire to help other people. I would still say they're doing something morally wrong if they fail to help other people because they're not taking that person's welfare into account.
Right. So where do you think morals come from? This has been an ongoing discussion on this show between, talking to Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris and Michael Shermer and Dennis Prager and many others, and there's sort of a religious argument. I think there's a secular argument for it. I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I think it's a really rich spot to figure out what people think about things.
Yeah, so that's a hard question. I'm not sure I have a satisfying answer to that. So, but maybe in terms of the religious question, there's this very old argument from Plato, the Euthyphro dilemma. I'm not sure if that's ever popped up in conversation, but the idea is basically, does God will something because it's pious independently of God's will, or is it pious because God wills it? And Plato's view was, well, it doesn't quite make sense to say that it's pious just because God wills it, because you could imagine, as a thought experiment, that God willing all sorts of terrible things, just as a thought experiment, that, you know, if God willed us to torture, it doesn't seem like that would make torture good. And so it seems more plausible to think that there is sort of an independent standard of goodness, even if you're a theist, for example, and you believe in God and you believe God has this intimate connection to morality. I think even on views like that, it makes sense to say that goodness is in some sense independent of the will of God. And so in terms of what more, that's again sort of an evasive answer as to what it's not. Where morality comes from, I mean, I'm inclined to say it comes from sort of what's good for human beings and maybe other sentient animals. So what sorts of things satisfy our interests, satisfy our preferences, cause us pleasure and pain, these sorts of things.
Do you think that's subjective, though, that different cultures obviously have different beliefs and different, you know, moralities and all sorts of things?
I would say it is not subjective in the sense that different cultures having different moral beliefs would show that nobody's wrong in those debates. So it might be very difficult to determine who is wrong, but I don't think the mere fact that different cultures have moral standards shows that it's subjective. So by analogy, you could imagine different cultures having different beliefs about astrology, for example. So some cultures think that astrology is a legitimate enterprise, other ones don't. They disagree about that, but I think it's safe to say that there is, in some sense, an objectively correct answer about that. Same thing with other sorts of scientific disputes.
Right, but do you think that that objective place, does that have to come from God per se, or can it come from, I mean, the discussion that we've had a lot around here and that a lot of people in this space talk about basically is, does objective morality either come from God and religion, or does it come from Enlightenment values? And then there's other arguments that it's only through religion that we got to Enlightenment values in the first place.
Yeah, that's tough. My hunch is that something like Enlightenment values. So I don't know, I'm somewhere in the agnostic space myself. And so I think that
you're a philosophy guy.
Right, exactly. So it's hard not to it's hard not to be an agnostic. So yeah, so I'm agnostic, but I'm also Jewish, and so it's all part of the kind of questioning, lack of certainty, and so forth.
Right.
So I think that there's enough reason to think that we have objective morality, even if you're not certain about the existence of God, that, yeah, we shouldn't worry that morality is going to collapse if people become atheists and agnostics.
Right, because when I've had this discussion, usually with conservatives, you know, they love to say, well, God gave us morality, you know what I mean? Your rights come from God. And for me, it's like, I think you have, whether they're God-given rights, or it's your right. Freedom is your right as a human being. Yeah. Or as Optimus Prime said, freedom is the right of all sentient beings. You know what I mean? Like, I think you are born free. I just think that's a humanistic approach, or you're born free. The government can take away your freedom, but it doesn't give it to you. And I think that's just a really interesting place to go for all these political discussions.
I agree. So that's right. I think that there are right and wrong ways to treat other human beings that are just true independently of whether or not the state happens to respect them. And this is the kind of Enlightenment thought. So John Locke said, look, in the state of nature, I would be wrong to kill you or assault you or steal your property. This is just the wrong way to treat human beings. It doesn't really have anything to do with the state. Now, we might want the state to come in and protect those rights, enforce those rights, and so on. But the rights themselves, the standard of the right and wrong way to treat other people does not itself come from the state.
All right, so before we get into some of the specific arguments that you make on economics and a bunch, how do you think our founders got so much of this stuff right? If I'm going on the assumption you believe they did. Right. But I mean, every time I go to DC and I go to the monuments and I read all of this stuff, and I just was in Philly yesterday, I mentioned to you, and I have now a copy of I have that little copy, like an old Republican senator, of the Declaration of Independence.
Is it the one that sets off the alarm at the? There was this thing with, like, it would set off the TSA alarms at the. Oh,
this one's just standard, simple paper, or whatever. I don't know. It's probably will set off some alarm somewhere, I'm sure. If I go to San Francisco or something, I'm sure a Constitution would set off an alarm. But I assume you think that they got much of this stuff correctly. How do you think they did it?
Yeah, so I think that, I don't know. So I think that some of it, and this is a bit outside of my own area, but I think that a lot of them were influenced by smart philosophers, people like, so I think the influence of someone like Locke on the Constitution is pretty evident. The influence of somebody like David Hume on people like Madison. I think that maybe that's a matter of controversy in history, but I think there's some evidence to suggest that. So I think that they were students of history, students of philosophy, students of economics, and this helped them get a lot right. And I think, obviously I think there were mistakes in the way that they applied it, and the way that like Jefferson's omission of mentions of slavery and things like that. But I think in terms of like the fundamentals, a lot of that was informed by really smart philosophers and economists.